Okay, so I'm really thrilled today. We have a really special speaker today who's not a physicist, but has a lot of background in related topics. So Kim Prather is the Distinguished Chair of Atmospheric Chemistry, and she's also a Distinguished Professor at Scripps and in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at UCSD. She founded and directs a center, an NSF Center on Aerosol Impacts of chemistry on the environment. And a lot of her expertise focus on understanding how aerosol impacts climate and how they modify clouds and precipitation. But since the beginning of 2020, I think she's been thinking a lot about aerosols in other contexts, and specifically about the impact of aerosol in the transmission of SARS-CoV-2. And she's really one of the key scientists who has played a role in trying to make sure that the public health guidance is keeping up with our scientific understanding. So it's a real pleasure to have Kim Prather here today. So take it away, and the audience, feel free to raise your hands and I'll try to pay attention for questions. I'm sure we will have a lot of questions on this topic, so we'll try to pay attention for those. Okay, go ahead, Kim.
Okay, well, great. So thank you. Thanks for the invitation to speak. Yeah, in the interest, as Risa pointed out so well, this sort of, I'm going to describe to you today some of the work that is separate from my day job, although it has become my job 24/7 for the last about 7 months. So it wasn't something I anticipated. Global pandemic is nothing anyone anticipates, but given that aerosols are sort of have become front and center, I will discuss today sort of what led me down this path and where things stand, and address many of the questions that have come up and how we've actually been able to convert the health folks, we're getting them there, to protecting us. So, okay, let's see. Okay, whoops, I went too far. All right, so basically, my entire career, nearly 30 years, I have studied aerosols, mostly, those in the atmosphere, and this just shows a global view of aerosols and how they circle our planet. And I, for part of my life, I fly through clouds and trying to understand which aerosol seed clouds and how that affects where precipitation falls. One of our sort of big discoveries was showing that microbes and dust from all the way from Africa change the snowfall in the Sierras by a lot. And so, I've had a really, major focus sort of looking outdoors, building instrumentation to do these measurements. My instruments look at single particles one by one in real time via mass spectrometry. And so that just gives you a little bit of background on, sort of my general interest in aerosols. One really interesting thing about aerosols, again, that's sort of part of my other life, is looking at how they get incorporated into things like hurricanes and clouds and affect precipitation patterns, which is becoming which has become a very important topic in the area of climate change. So that's sort of my outdoor field work. I'll touch on a little bit more of that towards the end, but in general, there's lots of different sources of atmospheric aerosols. As I say, I've spent a good chunk of my life looking at dust. The center focuses on sea spray. I'll touch on that a little bit more. There's, many sources. These by far, dust and sea spray, are the two most abundant ones. One thing we'll talk about today is, this concept of, why is 6 feet enough, to be far apart in terms of aerosols floating. I constantly get asked that question. This shows they can go a little bit further than 6 feet. Yet people are still surprised, but it's kind of funny to sort of have my two worlds, and there's such a disconnect in our or what we think about in terms of what is important. But aerosols go all the way from nanometer scale up to the micron scale, and that's sort of the size range that we look at. All right, so the center that I direct, I've been directing it now for about 10 years. And well, actually for 10 years. It's called the Center for Chemical Innovation. There are, I think, 9 of these now in the United States. They're $40 million for 10 years. I mean, they're broken into 2 5-year chunks. But what we proposed to NSF, I've been doing field work for 15 years and a little more than 15 years and doing field studies. And you go out, and the ocean has this profound control of our planet, and particularly the biology in the ocean. Phytoplankton blooms is something that's just can have a tremendous effect on the composition of the atmosphere. It, ultimately the ocean produces what seeds clouds, so can control climate that way. And so we just had I've had this very strong interest and had done many cruises where we went out over the ocean all over the world and tried to understand how this sort of connection between, the ocean and atmosphere. They talk to each other. And so, but what I will say is in these studies, I always sort of came away a little dissatisfied in the sense that, basically, you take the 2 weeks, 3 weeks that you get and you make the best story you can, but there's 25 things changing at the same time and you never quite understand the system. And so what we proposed to NSF was we were going to recreate the ocean and atmosphere with all of its biology, with breaking waves in the lab, and that we were going to use that to try and understand how the ocean is influencing clouds and climate. And so it's a large center. This is a picture from our last annual meeting. So I have to thank all the people that are involved. It's a great team that has come together. They're just an amazing team of people focused around chemistry, but we have physicists, we have engineers, we have oceanographers, we have data scientists. It's a really nice connection, microbiologists, really nice connection, interdisciplinary, connection that really takes advantage of being part of a center where you can work together and solve these really large scale problems. So what goes into transferring the ocean and the atmosphere into the lab? Well, first of all, you got to think about what's in the ocean. And it's full of life. They don't call it the living ocean for nothing. And this is where the virus and bacteria, my first virus bacteria connection came in. The ocean is loaded with viruses and bacteria, phytoplankton, proteins, sort of all the signs of life are there. It gives us between 50 and 85% of the oxygen we breathe through biology. And so, a lot of these species are, biological species are hydrophobic. They don't really want to be in the ocean. So they tend to be enriched at the very surface of the ocean. And then when waves crash and bubbles burst, and that's a lot of really cool physics, I have to say, which I also study. And that's a talk I could give for another day. But basically, that bubble bursting process can enrich all of this biology and transfer it from the ocean to the atmosphere. And so we've shown, all of these things become airborne, even enzymes get out and become even more active when they're in the air. So it's a really, challenging problem, much more than thinking about. I think most people that try to replicate the ocean and the atmosphere, they spray sodium chloride and that's it. And that is not going to produce the aerosols like the ones that really exist in the marine environment. So that has been our goal. We want to be able to do lab studies where we can control everything and be able to actually explain field results. That's kind of like the holy grail thing that we were looking for. So this is what it looks like in its grand form. And I don't know if okay. So this is the wave channel that we use. There's lights, they cycle day, night. This is during a big study called Seascape that we did last summer. This, to calibrate you, this room is usually empty except for the channel. So we bring real seawater in, we put lights on, we induce, we add nutrients to get the biology, the phytoplankton bloom going, which gives you the bacteria, which gives you the viruses, and starts this whole cycle to allow us to look at the ocean in a very, very isolated way. So this is just to give you a flavor for kind of my day job of what it normally is. And it does lead to viruses. So basically, one of the things we did in CAICE is once we had the ocean isolated, we started asking questions like, do all the viruses and bacteria that are in the ocean make it into the air? There's lots of pathogens, there's lots of toxins, there's all kinds of things that are in the ocean. Do they, once we basically had to get the proper bubble size distributions, get the physics right to make the physical production mechanisms right. Then we had to get the biology right. And then we started asking the question, what gets out? And so, 1977, there was a paper published in Science, Virus Transfer from Surf to Wind. Actually, turns out people were detecting viruses way back then. Not much was done about it after that. There's lots of pathogens in the ocean. They get in largely through pollution runoff and raw sewage, and I'll talk about that in some detail at the end of my talk. But what we did, and this is sort of kind of a complicated figure, but just the take home here is we looked at the bacteria, which is the wheel on the top, and the viruses, which is the wheel on the bottom. And we looked at all the different species, and we asked, do we see any sort of enhancement of what we see, you know, more in the air or more in the ocean, you know, or does just everything get launched? And so this just shows the as I say, the take home is that certain types of bacteria with certain, we found out very specific cell wall structures that are very hydrophobic, like the air bubble interface, they get enriched in the air like crazy. The viruses at the bottom, note the lipid enveloped viruses are in pink. They tend to be more enriched in the air. And when we talk about the SARS-CoV-2, which I'm going to talk about now, you know, that has a hydrophobic lipid envelope. So it's not that surprising that you would expect it to also potentially be transferred into the air. And as I said, I'll come back to that at the end. We were working on this problem before SARS-CoV-2 came along. So we were just looking at the general question of bacteria and viruses. We weren't thinking about SARS-CoV-2. So just to put a little bit of a advertisement out there, I guess, if you will, as we have this massive facility, well, we also got funded sort of an add-on to build a massive simulator that allows us to simulate past and future climates. And we can change the temperature of the water. We can make sea ice. We can make winds up to 19 meters per second. So we can start looking at sort of transfer with hurricanes of aerosols as well as gases. So, and the idea is to integrate a massive smog chamber in the middle. So we'll be able to start finally, a big goal in CAICE has been to look at basically interactions between the ocean and the atmosphere, but also interactions between humans and these natural emissions. So this is coming online in 2021. It's a facility everyone can use. We have lots of visitors all the time. I just wanted to put that out there. Okay, now shifting gears a little bit. This is sort of what Risa had asked me to talk about. I think she's been seeing me on Twitter. I've become quite active on social media, much more than I ever have been in my whole life. It has its pluses and its minuses. So today we'll talk about most of the pluses. But you know, the question is, is there a question, Risa? Was it?
You're good. You're good.
How is, just because I mentioned your name, you had to show up, huh? How is SARS-CoV-2 being transmitted through, you know, how has this become a global pandemic? And how has our view, most importantly, one of the things I'll talk about is how has our view changed over the course of this pandemic, and what role have I and a handful of other scientists that also look at aerosol physics and chemistry, how have we played such a huge role in sort of getting this switch to happen? It has been really challenging, I will say. But, you know, I'm at a point in my career where, you know, I love the science, but I want it to make a difference. And this was something that clearly hopefully will make a difference. We're still working though. So this is the handful of people at the bottom that I want to acknowledge, that I've had many conversations with aerosol scientists, as well as Chip Schooley, who's an infectious disease doctor, he's the first MD that I sort of pulled into the dark side of the aerosols to say, you know, we're not so crazy on this aerosol transmission pathway. Okay, but up front, I'll just say, this is not a 4-hour talk. So it's really I'm gonna give you sort of the Reader's Digest condensed version. So how is respiratory disease, how do we normally think of respiratory disease being transmitted? And this is medical dogma. It has existed for 100 years. And so, you know, there's 4 basic ways: direct contact, touching a surface, putting the germs on there and touching that, droplets, and this is what we're going to focus on here today. Droplets, really big droplets that like come out, like we call them mini cannonballs. They're on this projectile path. They're falling rapidly to the ground. And aerosols, which are the smaller stuff that are also emitted, but they tend to float in the air. And so historically, there has been this 5-micron cut. And getting at the physics, this makes no sense. So basically, what the medical community has thought for decades, it's in all the medical textbooks, it's what Fauci thought, it's what CDC thought, it's on the WHO website. Basically, the standard belief was that anything above 5 microns or above would fall to the ground within 2 meters, within 6 feet. Anything below 5 microns is an aerosol, and that would float in the air. But the focus from a protection and a control strategy has been aimed at these droplets. You always hear droplets, droplets, droplets. And so, 6 feet should be enough, you should be safe. And nobody was thinking about what happens if aerosols turn out to be important. So nobody really completely understands where the 5-micron cut came from. It's not supported by aerosol science at all. And so this is really the point where in some ways we've gotten past it, but in other ways some places like WHO are still stuck. Speaking of WHO, so this is the WHO director, just to give you a little history. In February 11th, he announced that this virus, SARS-CoV-2, that leads to COVID-19 is airborne. It's still on there. You can go find the video. He said it. He said the word airborne, which is also another story that, I'm not supposed to really use the word airborne because that's supposed to be reserved for a special meaning. It has a very special meaning in the medical community, which I can come back to. But basically, he said it was airborne. And then in March, started putting out lots of social media that basically said, fact check, COVID-19 is not airborne. And basically the point here was that, transmission only occurs through these bigger drops, things bigger than 5 microns. These come out in coughs and sneezes, and they will settle to the ground within, depending on whether you're here in the US or in Europe or whatever, it's 1 to 2 meters. So between 3 and 6, basically 3 and 6 feet. This is what's referred to as contact transmission. And so what we were all told at that time by WHO and CDC, in fact, was that we should focus on cleaning surfaces. And you probably all remember that quite well. We need to stay at least, depending on where you live, 1 to 2 meters apart. Masks are not really that effective, but also, we really should be saving them for frontline workers because there was a shortage. And if you're coughing or sneezing or have a temperature, you should stay home. That's the view. That's how sort of the standard view of any sort of respiratory disease. So, around this time, Wired came out with a really great article that said, they say coronavirus isn't airborne, but it's definitely in the air. So people were starting to question, public was getting really confused. Like, you're saying it's not airborne, but it's in the air. And a mask, you can inhale it and it gets blocked by a mask, but it's not in the air. Like, it was just massive, massive confusion. So a number of aerosol scientists that I showed before, and a few more actually, we all jumped in and started trying to get out the proper messaging and try and change this decades-long medical dogma. So here, so basically, in April, Lydia Maraska came out with this paper that basically said up front, clear back in April, air transmission issues should be taken seriously now. We can't wait till we understand it perfectly. We need to fix it. And we plead with the international and national authorities to acknowledge the reality that this virus spreads through the air. And as many of you maybe know, our president was announcing it was in the air back in February. But for some reason, we were stuck, and CDC and WHO would not change their recommendations, which affected, all of our reopenings, including schools and everything else. So I decided, I looked at all the pieces and decided to write a science perspective. And I wrote this with Chip Schooley, the infectious disease doctor, and basically just reviewed the data. How is this virus getting around and what can we do about it? And so I basically said, it's airborne. And the tricky thing about this virus is that, once it's in aerosols, it's you have to start thinking about where is it coming from? And what's different about this virus is it doesn't come, it can if you cough or sneeze, but they say as many as 90% of the people who are spreading it aren't coughing and sneezing. They are just talking. And so it turns out that when you talk, again, this is physics, and it's just like the physics, it's almost exactly like the physics of the bubble rupture that happens on the surface of the ocean. But basically, when you talk, your vocal cords vibrate, and that can rupture. And if there's viruses in your throat and down in your lungs, you can breathe it out. So that's where the aerosols are coming from. It's not this cough or sneeze releasing tons of massive droplets. It is basically thousands of aerosols that can come out of your mouth containing this virus every minute. And some people can emit, some people we call super emitters, that we don't quite understand why they're these super emitters, they can emit tens to hundreds of thousands of this virus a minute while they're speaking. So as opposed to like little mini cannonballs that fall to the ground like droplets, these aerosols can actually float in the air for hours. And the analogy we use, the best analogy you can think of when anybody asks me, how far should we be apart? What should we do indoors? Think cigarette smoke. Think being in an enclosed room with no ventilation with just one cigarette smoker. You know, how long does it take before the whole room is hazy? So this was a big push for us to start thinking about how this disease is getting transmitted in the form of aerosols. So, you know, basically the mode of transmission is aerosols. Once they're in the air, you inhale them. You know, we produce them just by speaking. The louder you talk, when you sing, it also produces them. People tend to be most infectious before symptoms occur. So they aren't staying home. You know, they don't have a temperature. So people are out walking around, going to bars and restaurants, enclosed environments with poor ventilation. This is where the spread can occur. So indoor risk is highest. It's 20 times more likely to catch it indoors than outdoors. In fact, there's very few cases outdoors. You know, basically you have to start thinking about when you're indoors, how long are you indoors? How many people are indoors? How's their ventilation? These are really important questions. And the thing that we've really been pushing is if you're indoors, masks should be worn, even if you're 6 feet apart. This saying, we're trying to get CDC to drop this now, you know, if you can't socially distance, take off your mask. That just shouldn't be there. You just should always wear a mask when you're indoors. And also really important thing is contact where you touch it and you touch your nose, touch your mouth, leads to one sort of type of like a level of severity of the disease. But inhaling, these aerosols are tiny. They can go completely deep in your lungs. And by doing so, they can bypass your immune system. And then start replicating really fast, like up to 3 times faster than the original SARS virus, which was a major respiratory issue, right? And so once they start to replicate, your immune system has no idea, your body has no idea it's under attack until it's kind of becomes too late. And that's when you can get these huge responses that aren't good in your system. All right, so the other thing to recognize, and one thing we pointed out, when you wear masks, you're wearing masks to block the source. That's the number one reason. You're protecting others. It is a courtesy to wear, and this is what people have been doing in Asia for a very long time, right? It's just respect. But it also will, it's bidirectional flow. So you can it also protects you. And if you're wearing a mask and the other person's wearing a mask, the amount you inhale is much less, which reduces the chance you're going to get sick. And if you do get sick, there's actually studies that have shown that you get far less sick because you've inhaled a lot less virus. All right. So, okay. So public messaging, I think I'm up over probably at this point 500 interviews. Other scientists that are doing this are in that same ballpark. So we've done thousands of interviews. Basically getting the word out, explaining things in a clear way, trying to get the public, because if the public can understand, they can make better choices. I mean, why hide things? It has to be transparent. And so, I did a lot of different stories with CBS. This is the chief medical correspondent. He did an interview of me that was sort of just me talking for 18 minutes that has gone very viral. I was on CNN. I did a bunch of different interviews, bunch of media stories after writing this paper, this perspective in science. And August 6th was a turning point. This is the day I had been sort of pestering Tony Fauci and sending him my paper and telling him it was aerosols and telling him they don't fall to the ground. And I finally had a chance to brief him. Myself and Don Milton, another aerosol scientist, met with him and basically said, 5 microns doesn't mean anything. They can fly further than 5 microns. We also we're getting so many questions, thousands of questions, that we created a FAQ, which, I can share with people if they want it, but it has everything. It has how to protect yourself. It has all the physics, all the chemistry, all the references. it's actually put together by a lot of people who put a lot of time in, but it answers about schools, ventilation. And so, yeah, people are interested, we did that. But the message that we sent, I was told not to use the word airborne because I would scare people. People would think of the show Contagion. And I can tell you, I have not scared. I'm not aware of scaring anybody. So, because what I say is that once we acknowledge it's in the air, this is a very fixable problem. It's very easy to filter aerosols out of the air and to make sure that you're dealing with clean air wherever you are. So the evidence supporting aerosol transmission, there was a workshop that we did that the National Academy organized. I was one of the organizers. I was also one of the participants. So because we were getting concerned that there wasn't action at the public health level, they decided to have the Environmental Health Matters Initiative decided to just do sort of almost an emergency meeting. So we did this in 7 weeks. We put this thing together and pulled it off. It was kind of crazy. It was incredibly intense, but we decided we needed to review the literature and get sort of a scientific understanding consensus of where we stood to try and, again, another way to add a little extra pressure to help protect the public a little bit more. So if anybody's interested, this is up. It's 11 hours recorded. It takes everything all the way from production, how you get infected and what we know. It's actually very, very complete workshop. So size is critical, and this gets at the physics side of things. Why, what if 5 microns isn't it? What is it? We said in this workshop, we all agreed, well, let's use 100 microns. That is much better, and I'll explain why. First of all, this virus isn't naked, which if it was, it would be like 150 nanometers. It is encased in respiratory fluid. And so it's more, especially coming out of speech and talking, it's probably, most of them are probably between 1 and 3 microns by the time they dry down. That's kind of the size scale. Very filterable. 1 microns with a mask or filtration system, HEPA filters, MERV filters, these are all incredibly easy, relatively easy to filter. So once the size basically determines, how long it stays in the air, how far it will go, whether it will follow the surface, it controls all of the, basically the properties, the aerodynamic properties, including, as I'll show in a minute, where it goes in your lungs. And so, how infected you're going to become depends on the size as well. And so that's shown here. Large droplets, there's so few of them. For every big drop, there's probably 1,000 to 10,000 aerosols. And so just the probability, if you're close to someone, that's where the concentrations are going to be the highest. But that one drop has got to, fly out of someone's mouth and hit either on your eyes, nose, or mouth perfectly. And so the probability of encountering a droplet directly is actually pretty small. But if you think of the aerosols, there's thousands of them floating. And especially if you're close, the concentration is closest to the source. That's why you want to always stay back from people. And these can get inhaled into the lungs. And so what we proposed was the cut should be 100 microns. We should move this cut to 100 microns. Ironically, there was very careful work done by Wells back in 1934. This is the size cut that he said he sees a difference in behavior as well. And so it's nothing new. It's just based on physics and aerodynamics of how things actually behave. So, this is just the composition. It's proteins, sodium chloride. When it dries down, there's a little bit of virus, not very much, and a little bit of surfactant. This is an electron microscopy image of what they look like, but it's just, it's largely salts and biological material, mostly proteins. All right, so what's really interesting, again, getting at production mechanisms, which is the physics side, which I love. Basically, there's actually different modes. We always say there's a continuum of sizes produced, but there's actually different size modes that are produced. So there's sort of a sub 10 micron size mode, and then stuff that comes out of the mouth are much bigger, the droplets, the spray. And so what's interesting is that you can fit this. And the speech comes from, sort of these sizes. So they'll have very different composition than things from deeper in the lungs versus things in the mouth. And so, depending on where it comes from, where it originates, what size it ends up, it can have very different impacts on your health. And so, actually, sorry. Okay. So if you look at WHO's definition, this is the break. Aerosols are this part and ballistic drops are all of these. And so this is what we have been sort of pushing to get out of this historical view. But if you look at basic physics, this is just still air. This isn't moving air. So this is the worst case scenario, I would say. Something that's, 3 microns will stay in the air for an hour and a half. Something that's a half a micron or a micron, which some of these can be, they'll stay up for 12 hours. And this virus can remain infectious. It's been shown to remain infectious once it's in an aerosol for up to 16 hours. So, if you can fill a room with these, they can float around and they can remain infectious. This was the slide that sort of was the aha moment for Tony Fauci. And so basically what this shows is if the air is moving, there's always air currents, right? So there's low air velocity on the left, high air velocity on the right for different size particles. And what you see is a 5 micron particle, even a 5 micron, a big one, can go 100 meters at low velocities. It can go 400 meters at higher air velocities. So, this concept of 6 feet is really not appropriate. And so, especially as I say, for this particular virus. So Anthony Fauci talked about this publicly. You can now hear him talk about aerosols. On September 10th, it was a big day. He basically said this has been a real misunderstanding. We have, gotten it wrong. These wild aerosol and particle physicists have approached us and made it very clear. And the bottom line is there is much more aerosol involved than we thought in transmitting this virus. So now now things shift. If you now do 100 microns, you can see that almost everything are aerosols and droplets that are so big that they will, as I say, fall to the ground. The other critical part of the spread of this disease, and this is super important, this is the part we're still grappling with, is I mentioned this is the number of particles that are put out of different people. So what you see is there's people that some people hardly produce any aerosols. And some people produce, lots of aerosols. And so if one of these people, these are not infected people, these are just, you produce aerosols when you talk. So these will contain infectious virus if you are sick. And so, it's one of these things where you just don't, whether you're in a room, some people spread, one of the things they know for this, they give a R naught, which is how many people you spread it to. That's kind of meaningless because it's an average value. In fact, some people can spread to 20 people. And there's a lot of people that only spread to none, to one or none. And so that's what's called the Pareto principle, where it's been shown that for this virus, is that my red mark on there? Anyway, for this virus, basically, you basically can see that, about 10% of the infections 10% of the people are causing 80% of the infections. So there's just something between the person that may be a super emitter and the conditions. And that's what leads to super spreader events, which I'm showing here. Is that red showing up on yours or is it just on mine?
Yeah, I don't know what it is. Let me just make sure it's not somehow from Zoom. Oh, no, let me try clearing.
I think it's, there it goes. Perfect. Yay. Thank you.
There we go.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So this is the big thing that we believe is causing the majority of this spread. If we can figure out these situations and figure out how to get people to avoid these situations, we can solve this. And so the biggest thing is indoors is not good. There's certain high risk locations. What are high risk locations? Indoors, low ventilation, talking, actually how deep it goes in your lung and how much you inhale has to do with how sort of your level of exertion too. So that's what makes gyms worse than restaurants and bars. And so, just for the public to know, this is the condition where you'll be exposed to the most virus. This is the condition where you'll be exposed to the least virus. That helps people make, the right decisions. Tokyo trains are incredibly crowded, they're next to each other. They're not 6 feet apart, but they all are wearing masks and they're told they cannot talk. And there has not been a single infection that has been reported yet. This is a super spreader event at a Korean call center where somebody on this side was sick and it spread. As you can see, there's no way, these people didn't all touch the same contaminated surface. This has to be airborne. You've also heard of the choir event up in Washington, probably churches. There's all these events where, 90% of the people at the event get sick from one person. And there is no other way to explain this except for airborne or aerosol transmission. So what size are they in? This is parts we're still learning about. There aren't very many studies. So first they said, okay, you've proven aerosols have come out, but we don't know the virus is in there. So this was a study that showed, yes, the virus can be detected in the smallest particles. We can find the virus in hospitals in the size range. This is showing, basically less than, I think, 4 microns. And so, but here you're not looking at infectivity. You're just looking for, is the RNA that corresponds to this virus present or absent? Okay, so yes, it's in the aerosol. So that was the first bar that we crossed. Then it became, okay, but you don't know that it's infectious. You just know the RNA is there. So it's really hard. This is one of the hardest, this is something we're working on right now, is how to collect viruses and not blow them up, essentially, so that they don't remain infectious, just because collecting things from the air is pretty hard, can be harsh. So this is a special sampler that condenses water on the viruses and grows them and collects them into a really small solution. And this is and they can use this special gel that, can hold things together. And when they use that, they found this infectious virus in a hospital. Now, some people will say, well, it wasn't that much, but think about it. In the hospital, by the time you go to the hospital, you're that sick. You're actually probably not shedding that much virus anymore. And also, the air is pretty darn clean. So the fact you detect anything is actually saying quite a bit. So, these things, so again, it's just one of these things where the proof has to be there. The bar just kept rising. They believe it's in droplets, but there's not one piece of evidence that says that it's in any droplets. But yet for the aerosols, we keep sort of ramping up to get the bar moved. All right, so continuing to add pressure, we wrote a letter, open letter to the World Health Organization. 239 people signed it. There's Lindsay Marr wrote this, yes, the coronavirus is in the air. Basically it was just a lot of pressure to say it is time to address that it's in the air so we can stop this pandemic. So CDC, around a little bit, sort of around this time, had sort of, basically the belief, as I mentioned, was that it spread easily between people through contact. September 18th, they suddenly came up where they said, yeah, it could be spread in these aerosols. And this is thought to be the main way the virus spreads. This quietly went up on their website on a Friday, and it quietly came down on a Monday, first thing on a Monday. And so went back to the original. So there was a big party by all the aerosol scientists and physicists here and over the weekend, but then it disappeared. And nobody really, well, we could imagine, there's lots of stories about what happened, but we didn't know. They came so close to having the right answer and they took it away. So we went back on the this is like crazy. Anyway, I'm going to have PTSD by the time it's over. So John LaPook, back again. We got together, we worked for a whole weekend with producers and writers and wrote what we would like the CDC, what we thought people should be saying to help people, because people were desperate for help. And so we warned, airborne virus is being spread. These are the things we know. We updated, sort of all the evidence that backs it, did a lot more on this topic. And then we decided to write another paper for Science. This is a letter, 300 words. So it was like the most challenging 300 words I've ever written. This time we said, okay, we're going to harmonize the language, because the world thinks we're arguing. The world thinks we're disagreeing. We're not disagreeing. We're just calling the same thing 2 different things. So it looks like we're disagreeing. If the public sees disagreement between the scientists, right, there's zero trust, there's zero hope. So I got my friend Chip Schooley on. Oh, he's become my friend. I never knew him before this, but then then Don Milton's an MD. He pulled on a couple of other people working on OSHA and different types of mask standards. So Lindsay Marr and I, 2 aerosol people and 4 MDs, signed on to this letter. And we basically just said, here it is. This is how it has to be. It has to be defined at 100 microns. And this is why it matters. And this is how it works. And CDC, we got to get this fixed. We have to harmonize the language, because there's a lot of people and thousands more people are going to die if we don't do this. Within 7 minutes of ours, which was embargoed till 11 a.m., and I'd shared it with Tony Fauci and he shared it with CDC. So our paper with the embargo was lifted at 11 a.m. At 10:53 a.m., CDC came out with new guidance, and they put it back, and they have airborne. It's different than the first version, but it says airborne, and there's places where it's pretty darn close to being what we need. It's not quite there yet. So sort of the status update is now we are talking with CDC and working with them on trying to harmonize this language so that we can give better recommendations to schools and to places in opening. So what is the summary of this part of my talk? Basically, airborne transmission is the dominant pathway. There's no question. People say, is it more than 50%? Is it more than 90? The more I look at it, I mean, just based on probability alone, it's got to be more than 90%. But again, that's really hard to tease out of epidemiology studies. So I don't know if we'll ever be able to definitively prove it. People are exposed to both at the same time. So it's pretty tough. This virus has taken advantage. It's created a very secretive, discreet way to get around. It behaves like cigarette smoke. Basically it spread through people that just don't know they're sick. And this is what's leading to a massive number of the outbreaks that we've been experiencing. Okay, so, masks are absolutely essential. The places that have used masks have never shut down. It's crazy to me that we keep talking about it's a balance between economy and masks. If everybody would just wear their masks properly, I should add, we could all go back to our lives. When we're indoors, they should be worn at all times. You can clean the air either through ventilation, just open the windows, or outdoors is much safer than indoors. Barriers, everybody's in love with barriers. I would say we say you need to exercise a little caution. These are flow dynamic simulations that show that things, aerosols, they don't, drops will hit a plexiglass barrier and smash and stop. Aerosols will just flow right around. Same thing with face shields. Aerosols don't care. They just follow the flow lines. There's all kinds of things you can do. You can create these inexpensive box filters. I have them in my house. Actually, when it's smoky up there, this is a great tool. It drops my indoor concentrations down of particles drastically for $40 each. And so this is a really nice fix. But we're repeating history here and not doing it very well. This is from 100 years ago. These are kids learning outside from the last time we had a pandemic. They also just opened the windows in the classrooms. They had to get in blankets because it was cold, but people did it. And we knew ventilation was important, and we knew these things. And somehow we've lost, and they also stopped wearing masks and had another wave, so it's like, it's hard to tell this story in some ways, especially since we haven't completely solved it yet. So avoid limit your time indoors. Face shields and plexiglass are not great. Should it surprise us? I'm going to go through this so there's time for questions. Should airborne transmission surprise us? No, it shouldn't. It's been happening probably with all the other respiratory viruses too. It's just, especially SARS-1, which looks the most like this virus. And so it was shown that, probable long-range transmission, people need to open up their minds and, that we need to fix this. This was, back in 2003, the outbreak was back in 2003. In that case, what they found was sewage, which this is also in sewage. So you can't completely rule it out, but this is also, basically they showed that at an apartment building or building complex, they could model the airflow because people on the upper floors and only in certain buildings got sick. And so basically it had to be the air. And so, this was after the fact, that basically, again, fear and panic basically sort of stopped the health authorities from saying anything. And so again, we're repeating history. So the last thing I'm just going to touch on really quick, and I'll just, because I have to get something in about my own, because just to sort of show you, we are working on viruses. This is a study we've done where we're looking at runoff into the ocean and looking at what becomes airborne. It's well known that when dirty water goes into the ocean, the beaches get shut down, but nobody thinks about the air. And so we've at one point released dye into the ocean. This shows sort of dye fields in the ocean on a day where we saw it inland and on a day when we didn't. So we've been trying to understand this back to this connection between the ocean and the atmosphere. This is going to become so important with sea level rise and with flooding and with all the sewage that's going in the ocean. Down in this region, there are literally millions of gallons. In 2017, this is sewage dumping into the ocean, 143 million gallons with all kinds of pathogens and toxins, metals, pollutants. These are all in the water, and we always think about the surfers and swimmers, but we don't think about the people who are breathing the air, which is many more people. So when SARS-CoV-2 came along, I went to NSF. They funded our proposal in 24 hours, actually less than 24 hours, to go out and look for SARS-CoV-2. There's this sewage that runs in, it's well documented. There's a treatment plant in Tijuana. It goes through this valley, it dumps in the ocean. And so we've been looking for it in the river as well as in the ocean and in the air. And so this is an ongoing project in our group, is just trying to understand, you know, the health effects of what becomes airborne in coastal regions. So I'll just finish up with saying that, you know, this is an 8-year-old's, you know, she drew this for her mom, and didn't know her mom. This is another Twitter success story, but she listened, and she didn't like masks, but she, you know, listened to one of my CBS interviews, and she came back with, they're just COVID spitball spaceships. And so we should just wear masks to protect ourselves. And so, you know, that's, for me as a science communicator, this is the ultimate compliment that an 8-year-old got it, you know? And so we've written this FAQ. Again, I can share this with people. You know, this is back to 1918. I'll just say quickly, this is kind of makes you laugh, kind of makes you cry, you know, abstain from closed spaces, keep your mouth clean, you know, follow the advice of your doctor, ignore ignorant people who invite you to drink alcohol or consume tobacco. So the wrong people giving you, where have we heard of that? And the last thing I'll say is, we lost a giant in atmospheric chemistry, and Mario Molina passed away on October 7th, and he was, put simply, my hero. He was my supporter. He's my biggest supporter. And so it's been a really tough month. But the reason first of all, I just want to acknowledge him as an amazing person and scientist, but I also want to say, without him, you know, he showed for the ozone hole, he showed for climate. He actually was working on SARS-CoV-2 as well. That, you know, doing the science, it's great, it's fun, we love it, but we also, it's, you know, pushing it hard, even when you get massive pushback. We really need to do that to help society and social justice as much as we can. And with that, I will stop, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kim. It was really clear and really helpful to see how it connects also to the other work on aerosols and climate. It's great. So we got a bunch of questions in the chat already. If you feel free to raise your hand. Let me just start with a few from the chat. One is just, could you say a little bit more about masks, and in particular, like which masks are most effective? You know, are there properties of the mask that are particularly important?
Excuse me. Yeah, there's been a lot of studies. Warning, there's been a lot of not so great studies, because people just thought you could, you know, we didn't really think the studies through. So there's a few really good studies, especially there's one that just came out recently. Simple answer, you know, I wear a surgical mask. You know, I'm very comfortable with that. You know, I also have N95s. If I go, you know, that I'm prepared, if I go on an airplane, I'll be wearing an N95, probably a double, an N95 and a surgical. Goggles are important, but layers. So a 2-layer homemade mask, not, you know, like with a pretty good high thread count matters. So if it's too porous, you know, things will float through, you know, can float through more easily, right? And so, but, you know, if you make it too thick, then you can't breathe. So that's not good. But there's actually quite a few publications on this. On the FAQ, if you go to the FAQ, which I can put that out for people, you can see we have all the references, the ones that we trust more than others. There's been a lot of studies done on which masks work and which ones aren't so great.
Could you say a little bit about airplanes? I think, you know, we've heard that maybe the ventilation is okay there because the air is filtered well. How would you fly, or how would you feel about flying? You mentioned you would wear an N95.
I don't know when I'll fly again. I'm not going to fly right now. You know, because it's human behavior. The study that said how safe they are, that was United plane. They, you know, it's like assuming everybody wears masks. They don't eat, they don't talk, they don't turn their head, you know, their masks are fitting perfectly, right? Lots of assumptions. in general, though, I will say that airplane air, it undergoes a massive number. I think it's 14, something. I saw ridiculous, way more than any other room you're in. It undergoes a lot of air changes per hour. And so it is filtered a lot. That is a true statement. But the problem is this close contact. If you are the unlucky one, there's multiple studies that keep coming out on people being exposed on airplanes. And it goes further than the 2 rows that CDC says to check. There's one that just came out, it went 7 rows, so I still would be nervous just because of human behavior, especially if that plane is crowded. The other dangerous part, I think, is that they aren't so great about air handling when you're getting on and getting off. You smell it, right? They don't do a good job. And so it'd be more the boarding and unboarding that I'd be really nervous, because they're not filtering the air during those times. And that can take a while. So I'm not flying. I don't know when. I was just thinking about this. I don't know when or if I'm going to fly for a while. I am not comfortable. It's just too closed, too small a space that you don't have any control over. But I know people who have, and they haven't caught it yet.
Yeah. Could you say a little bit more about outdoors? So we know outdoors is a lot safer, but there's obviously still some risk. I think as we're all thinking about the fact that we're stuck with this for a while, we also want to see people. How are you thinking about outdoors? Is there a time? We have a question in the chat. Is there a time distance separation beyond which non-masking is safe?
Yeah, I mean, I have had, everybody's dying for some social interaction. Risa, you know me, right? So, but I still, outside is how I meet people, and I've done it very few times. I still wear my mask. I've just gotten used to a mask. My husband said something the other day about, you didn't take that off? I didn't even remember that I had it on. I've gotten so used to this mask. But basically, outdoors, the further apart, the better. The other thing I tell people is pay attention to wind direction. That's really important, because it can just carry it directly because the beauty of outdoors, right, is dilution. Dilution is your friend. But if there's wind blowing from a sick person to you and you're sitting there talking to that person for a half hour or an hour, that's not going to go so well, right? And so you have to think about all these things. I haven't eaten out at a restaurant yet outdoors either. If I do, when I do, I will be upwind. I can tell you that. So it's like you still have to think, because there's not very many cases outdoors. It is much, much safer, and we have to live our lives. And I just think that the risk is much lower. It's never zero. That's the reality. But I do think that, if you're going to meet people, we live in California, luckily, so we can still use the outdoors a lot more.
Great. So we have a question about children and babies in particular, just in terms of the transmission. So are they breathing in and out the same amount of aerosols as adults do? No, they don't. And there's so much. This is a place where there needs to be more work, because they just don't know much about younger kids and how much they transmit. They just haven't been tested. They don't show the symptoms. And so people, they really don't show the symptoms. People, symptoms, it tends to be like, especially 20 to 30 is the age where they really don't show the symptoms and they're walking around without masks, right? But younger kids, we know even less. They do very little testing on really young kids. And there was some belief like, oh, they breathe out, there's much lower volumes of air. So by definition, they can't breathe out as much aerosol. But there was just a paper that came out saying that they actually can be, quote, the super shedders. Some of them, when they're sick, they breathe out more. So it's just so unknown. What I say about kids is, it's schools. I'm advising lots of schools on reopening, and I've told them, you do not go back unless you require masks. I don't care if the desks are 6 feet apart, and I think that was a mistake New York just made. They just shut it. I couldn't believe Cuomo. He was so close. They opened the schools, no masks with kids. They're just the carriers. I mean, anybody who's had kids, the kids bring home everything, right? And that's what happened. So, masks. And the good school districts are working hard to check the ventilation, look at windows, all that kind of stuff too. There is a way to open schools. You have to wait, though. The key in that is waiting for the community spread to be at a safer level. You don't want to open schools while the spread is still, and it's skyrocketing in a lot of places. So sorry, that's a long answer to it. Yeah, no, that's great. Super helpful. Any other, I don't see any raised hands. If anyone wants to raise their hand on the chat or chime in and ask another question. Since I don't see any, let me ask one more question just about, obviously we've gotten to this point. Things are not going well, even though the scientific understanding has evolved quite a bit. Based on what you've learned, what do you think people like the people on this call who actually can understand fluid dynamics, what role do you think scientists should play in sort of trying to educate?
I think we can play, again, there's been 10 of us, I don't even know how many of us that have been spreading the word like crazy. And I think the more people that understand how it's not that hard, and you just convince the public. So if people can communicate to their friends and family, I've sent out links to everybody and they send it to all their family members. People appreciate it so much. And so again, I'm happy there's like a sort of a thread of really helpful, the most helpful links, because there's so much information out there. It's a little overwhelming. I can share it, but then it's just sort of sharing and helping your friends and family and your universities and your school districts, understand, and people appreciate it a lot. I think we're really close. I think, as I say, I now am in direct contact with CDC, really good people at CDC. They have their hands tied a little bit. They don't say much, but I know that it's just a challenge. And so we're trying to maneuver, and I think we're really close to getting the right words out that will help. And that will be huge, because what happens is some of these school districts only go by the CDC guidelines. And if it doesn't say you're required to do ventilation in MERV 13 and this exchange rate, then they're not going to do it. And so we're talking to Congress. I talked to your senator one of the senators up there, Glazer. We're pushing for universal masking. We're pushing for money to go to schools to get filters in the classrooms and help. There's been people that have been told they can't buy a filter for their child's, or a teacher can't buy a filter for their child's classroom because it's not, they either have to have it for everybody or, right? So there's just a lot of holdback because of the lack of information.
So there's a few hands I'm going to call on. One question from the chat, since you just mentioned the filtration. What advice do you have for the air filtration within buildings?
Well, the problem with building, like one of the challenges with buildings is that, the easiest thing is just to open the windows and open doors, right? That's the easiest. But then, basically the filter that they put in the system has to be like, the one that's recommended is MERV 13, and it has to fit well. And that's pretty laid out well. And again, that fact, and it's pretty well understood right now. If you can't get that, there's some old buildings you cannot upgrade, especially schools, you can't upgrade that well. Then you want standalone HEPA filters or that box fan filter. It's a little noisy, but it works, because you're just trying to cut back the particles, and you're trying to, CO2. I have, actually it's right here. You can see I have a little CO2 measurement. Mine is 609 right now. So, it's a little, I'm breathing out some CO2. That will tell you if too much breath is being trapped in a room. And so all the schools use these. It's a super simple way to see if you have enough ventilation. So there's all kinds of little simple tricks like that. There's a million things you can do. There's a couple of really easy things that make a big difference.
Okay, Kevin, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks a lot for this talk. So you talked a lot about how there was issues with the messaging from the CDC and the WHO. And among the countries that have been wearing masks from the beginning, did any of them get the science right from the start, or are they correct kind of like by good luck?
Taiwan got the science right from the start. 24 million people, and they had 407 cases, 7 deaths, and the deaths were all imported from China. They didn't have any spread in Taiwan. So they learned. Hong Kong learned. Not everybody listened, so they had a couple of little bumps. Singapore, Vietnam, they have done really, really well. But Taiwan, I don't know. Some people say Vietnam's as good or better, but I think Taiwan is the lowest number. 450 cases out of 24 million people is amazing. But what they did What they did was they had masks for everybody. The government went into overdrive. They sent masks to everybody, which here we were going to do that, and they got stopped. They were made and ready to be shipped. Every household was going to get 5 masks. They stopped it. In there, everybody had masks. You could go with your, whatever government ID, get a certain number of masks every week. And that was huge. Then they knew all the ventilation stuff. They learned from SARS is the bottom line. So no, there are success stories. They never shut down their economy, never stopped.
Thanks. So what I've always been wondering is, why doesn't this knowledge propagate between countries when people can see that this is such a success?
It's a good question. I have to say the vice president of Taiwan is also an epidemiologist. And so, it's good to have a scientist in that. But, Fauci is also great. I love Fauci. And we have great scientists too. We just have leadership. Sadly, I try to stay out of politics in this conversation, but I'll just say our leadership doesn't listen. They didn't listen. Sadly. Hopefully they'll start listening soon.
Julian.
Oh, hello. Yeah, thanks. My question is about testing. So it is still true that it takes about 4 days until you will show positive in a test after being exposed, or
The average about,
or how long should I wait in that sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's so hard. Testing is complicated, especially when it's kind of hard, sometimes still hard to get. That's why these quick tests are going to be phenomenal. I think they're going to be saviors before we get the vaccine. I'll mention that in a second. But to your question, it takes about 5 days before on average, could be a day, but on average, the peak is about 5 days after 5 microns, 5 days after you've gotten sick. And so, that's what's tricky. People will say, oh, I tested today and I was negative, I'm good to go. But if you were exposed yesterday and you tested negative today, that's not all that surprising. You need to keep testing. So I just was writing an email to my group because a lot of them are traveling home for the holidays, and I'm trying to tell them how long they have to, they have to get tested when they get back. We have free testing for all our students. They get tested when they get back, and they have to, but they should come back and be here for 5 days, 7 days, test, and then they can come back to lab. So we're working out all those crazy details right now. To your question though about testing, it's just, you kind of have to save it up, right? You feel like, I can only get 1 test here and there, and right, it's kind of a pain still. That's going to change, I hope, very soon. I really hope very soon. There's a test now that takes about 15 minutes. It's like a pregnancy test. It is like cheap, $10, $15 a test, and you get the answer back. It's 97% accuracy. So once we can get to that point, then you can just go wild. Everybody can just have tests, and you can test and be sure. And, I think that's going to make a huge difference. Right now, the problem is we cannot, we'll check your temperature before we let you in the door is crazy, because most of these people don't have temperatures and they're shedding the virus, right? So, and they're not coughing and they feel great, right? So we have to be able to identify the sick people, and we have to have a place. The next trick is having a place to isolate them if they are sick, right? So that's another whole craziness that's popped up, is how do you make sure you have enough beds for quarantining and isolating people? Some places have done that better than others as well. There's also sewage testing, which nobody asked me about. We're also doing sewage testing for looking for big outbreaks. And that is another sort of safety net that we're using at UC San Diego. Sorry,
Awesome.
That was more than you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I have use of this time and actually ask you, in your opinion, how long it will take before we had a vaccine, or time to normal?
That is not my area of expertise. I just listen to Fauci, and
okay, thank you.
It's going to be a while. And even I'm told by infectious disease docs, which I have a lot of friends that are infectious, I'm told that even when we have one, it may only help half the people, and may not last that long. So we really just got to knock it back with the tools that we have. That's what I keep telling people. Don't think because people just are frustrated. Everybody's tired, everybody's worn down. I'm worn down. But if we could just knock it back, and it looks like you're doing that, like where you are, right? San Francisco's going yellow. You're doing it. I'm a little nervous. They're opening up the restaurants, so I hope they're careful, because, it's makes me nervous. That's where it starts to get dangerous, but hopefully they'll watch. But they're doing it with the numbers low. So I'm crossing my fingers that San Francisco can be it's the biggest city in the US that's doing well right now, I think. So that's great. So you can teach
the rest. Mark. Yeah, great.
I'm not surprised by the CDC going slow, but I was surprised that Fauci didn't respond more quickly. You know, with anybody who saw these super spreader events in restaurants and churches, I would have thought would buy this immediately.
Yeah, I wouldn't blame Fauci. He'd be the last one I'd blame. I have to protect Fauci. I mean, he is doing it all. And look, and he has kind of a challenging work life. Let's just say, let's leave it at that. I think he has his own opinions of what he would like to be doing, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I don't want to speak for him, but I wouldn't want his job for anything. And that guy is hanging in there, and we need him to hang in there. And so, you know, the decision was, you know, when I was giving him things, and as soon as he realized, he started talking about it. His public lectures, he immediately started talking about aerosols. He immediately went to Redfield. He immediately connected us, you know, with CDC. It's CDC that I'm having to get that advice from. You know, Fauci can say what he wants in as many million talks that he gives, but we need CDC and WHO. CDC is a million miles ahead of WHO, by the way. WHO is still refusing to say airborne, still. And that makes me so mad, because look how many people are dying worldwide. And what is the point of not saying it's in the air? I mean, I just can't even, and they have no aerosol physicists on their panels. They only have epidemiologists and sort of the more, what I would call the old school way of thinking. And they've been offered lots of aerosol people, and they, so I'm really disappointed in WHO.
Okay, thank you.
Andre.
May I ask you some practical advice? So what about these air purifiers and the choice of different filters for your home use?
Yeah, so if you go to, I'm going to put the fact. Can I maybe, Risa, do you have like the emails of people, or should I just put it in the chat?
Yeah, I put it in the chat a couple times actually. So
Okay.
yeah, so hopefully people can find it in the chat.
Yeah, that has it all. I mean, you get that, it has more information than you could ever use, and it's vetted by all of us. So it's actually really trustworthy information. So, you know, simple answer is you can go all the way from, you know, box fan with a MERV 13 up to, I have a, what's called an IQ Air, it's just a HEPA, fancy HEPA type filter that's running all the time. But you need to think about how big your room is for the size and all that. And all of that is in the FAQ.
Great. Okay, well, we should probably end now and let Kim get back to her life. Thank you so much, Kim. That was really, really informative and fantastic. I think a lot of people really appreciated it. It's nice to be able to hear it in terms that make sense to the scientists. So thank you again.
Yeah, no, thank you. And everybody stay safe, and we can get through this. We just gotta, yeah, it helps to get the word out. So anyway, thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, bye-bye.